Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. And today I have a special comparison. This is my favorite vintage bike that I currently have in the garage. This is a 1982 Suzuki GS1100G, and it's a project I've worked on for several years just to get it dialed in the way I want it. But it's set up, it's kind of a resto mod or cafe bike, you know, whatever you want to call it. But it's modified to go fast and to do it comfortably, and it's really set up nicely to my taste. The newcomer here is Kawasaki's 2002 ZRX1200R. The ZRX1200R is really a retro bike, and honestly, it was before its time. If they would have introduced this bike this year, it would sell like hotcakes. It's just a beautiful retro style machine with a big Ninja base motor. It's just a powerhouse of a motor, 1200 cc's. It has about 115 horsepower and 80 foot-pounds of torque at the rear wheel. It's just an entertaining bike to ride. But this is my favorite classic bike. I've actually owned multiple of the ZRXs. I've also owned multiple of the GS1100s. As far as my history with bikes, my first big bike was a GS1100G, and I did a similar cafe project to it. And so it wasn't on this bike, it was one that I had subsequently sold. And so then I moved into sport bikes, big sport bikes, and then from that I moved into the kind of the sport standards. I actually had a ZRX not long after they were introduced, and absolutely loved it. I love the fact that a sport standard gives you the performance of a sport bike, but the comfort of a UJM and the ability to either ride fast or slow as you feel like, and not be punished if you want to ride it slow. Sport bikes are great. They just punish you if you're trying to ride them anywhere near the speed limit. You know, that's why I've been in love with the sport standards for a long time. And this era of motorcycles, you know, you have basically a standard style bike with a small, bikini fairing on it. To me, they just look right. I love the look of both of these bikes. And to me, the ZRX is the best looking retro bike ever made. And honestly, it looks a whole lot like the GPZ model from the 1980s, early 80s. And I love that. And it's really interesting. This is Kawasaki's 50th year anniversary, and they're now making the livery on the bikes for the 50-year anniversary bikes is red with the silver and blue, like this has, with the gold lettering. So this bike would look at home on the showroom floor today. It really is a nice bike with nice touches. If you look at these bikes just on a spec sheet and just kind of on the face of things, they are both large 4-cylinder motors. They're inline fours. They both have the dual disc brakes up front. They both have the standard suspension. It's not like a unitrack rear. That's a standard style with the shocks. Both of these bikes are carbureted. They both have very good carburation. But if you look at some places where the ZRX really starts to have some advantage, it has the large liquid-cooled motor as opposed to the air-cooled motor in the Suzuki. It's liquid-cooled, it's a 16-valve head, and so the technology really shows in the engine compartment. And this bike honestly makes probably about 25 more horsepower and probably 10 or 15 more foot-pounds of torque at the rear wheel than the GS1100. Another area where the ZRX really shines is the fully adjustable suspension and just massive 6-piston caliper brakes up front, and then it's got the disc brake out back. Not as much of an improvement there, but really the front brakes are pretty astounding with the way that the amount of stopping power they have. The Suzuki, on the other hand, now I've upgraded the brakes, and they are good, and this bike actually stops better than it has a right to. I've upgraded the brakes with the Spiegler brake lines, but they are big single piston calipers, and they're operating on smaller diameter discs than the Kawasaki has, so it just doesn't have the ultimate stopping power that the Kawasaki has. So I thought you guys would be interested in seeing kind of back to back, how do these bikes ride and handle and perform, and you know, was there a lot of, you know, upgrades between 1982 and 2002? That's a 20-year span. You know, how much did motorcycles kind of evolve over the course of time? How are they actually out on the road? Well, let me get my helmet. I'll bring the camera along and we'll find out. Let's ride.
I'm currently riding Suzuki's 1982 GS1100G. This is my, I guess you'd call it a resto mod cafe bike, but I'm riding it back to back with Kawasaki's 2002 ZRX1200R. The ZRX is a kind of the style of bike that I was trying to mimic when I did this project. I wanted something that looked reminiscent of the superbike racers back in the early 80s, kind of along those lines. In order to improve the performance of this bike, I put an exhaust on it, a full Delkevic stainless exhaust. I've also upgraded the brakes with Spiegler brake lines, and the suspension with progressive suspension springs in the front and MGO shocks out back. Yeah, it's cool to ride these bikes back to back. And one thing I'm noticing, I've got wider handlebars on this GS1100, and that really allows me, in this lower speed stuff, it allows me to transition very easily. Seating position is a little bit more upright. They both feel firm, ride-wise. They both sound good. I just put an ART exhaust on my ZRX. That sounds really nice. Instrumentation-wise, this old GS1100G actually has a little bit more comprehensive instrumentation than the newer bike does. It actually has a gear indicator in addition to a fuel gauge and tach and speedometer and such. It also has a light that tells me if I leave my side stand down, which is actually really nice on a bike of this vintage. It was before the cutoff switch of bikes of today. I must say that the full exhaust on this bike actually sounds better to me. It's louder than the exhaust on the ZRX, which is only a slip-on. But I love the tone. The brakes on this bike they're only single piston calipers up front, but they honestly stop the bike very nicely. They've got good control. They don't have the initial bite of the ZRX's brakes, but they do have better low-speed control just because they're not grabby. And both bikes on this road, they ride a little firm, so I'm definitely on both of them. It's surprising how similar the ride itself feels. Both bikes are capable of generating pretty serious speed. On paper, that ZRX makes more power outright than this does, and probably even more torque, but it's a matter of degree. The motor in this bike is just a torque monster. It's the old 2-valve per cylinder, 8-valve motor. And both bikes are revving kind of around the same at 55, right around 3,000 RPM or so. And they both, as soon as you get on it, they just start to pull. I'm sure the ZRX has a higher top speed, and honestly, this bike is really fun from 0 to 85, but beyond that, you start to, with the wide bar especially, you can get a little bit of a wobble if you input, you know, you hit a bump and input into the steering. The ZRX has modern rubber on it and modern, more adjustable suspension, but this bike definitely doesn't feel outpaced in comparison. It still feels really nice. And it took me a little while to get the tuning straight on this bike, but after I got the tuning right, it really runs nice. So, still a stout performer, no hiccups. My tack isn't 100% accurate, so I'm always a little bit, try to be a little bit cautious on that. Don't want to over rev it. An advantage that the ZRX has over this bike is it has more high-speed stability. Man, it's really interesting, back to back, this bike has a little bit better wind protection. The fairing, I think you can see in the video, it actually, more of it's visible in the shot here. You know, it gives me a little bit better wind protection. I'm sitting a little bit more upright. The handlebar's a little bit wider, so it makes the steering, honestly, for a bike with the bigger diameter front wheel, this bike is very nimble. It doesn't have quite the stability of the ZRX, and, you know, ultimate cornering, you know, how many G's can you pull around a skid pad? That ZRX with the wider modern rubber on it is going to be able to pull more cornering speed, but this is certainly no slouch, and it's honestly probably, if I was going to do an all-day trip, this would be at least as comfortable, if not more comfortable. They both, you know, are on the firm side suspension-wise. The ZRX has, you know, ultimately, if I was going to do a racetrack day, the ZRX, I would be able to pull better lap times with that. It has the ultimate braking power, is really, really good. The suspension tuning is nice. Again, that modern rubber on it. I can get more lean angle into it. But for road riding, it's hard to argue with that. For road riding, I just really like this bike. It's just set up nicely for me. It does have a little bit of that vintage feel. It has a little bit more vibration than the ZRX, but in some ways it's just it's actually a little bit easier to ride. It doesn't take as much effort on the throttle, the actual throttle itself, and the brakes are less grabby at low speeds. Still one of my favorites. I'm currently riding Kawasaki's 2002 ZRX1200R back-to-back with Suzuki's 1982 GS1100G cafe project that I did. I'll tell you what, right off the bat, this bike feels small. It feels really tiny. It's got narrow handlebars, and Man, when I get on the gas, it takes the throttle travel on it takes a lot less throttle travel to really invoke serious speed. Just put the ART exhaust in this bike so it sounds nice. Hit some twisties here. Transition smoothly. Pulls hard out of the corners. There's definitely feels like there's a lot less bike in front of me. The fairing is lower. With the narrow bars, it's even though I'm in the wind more, I don't really put a whole lot of the wind doesn't end up going through my body and into the handlebars, so it doesn't affect the steering at higher speeds as much. I love that deep tone of this motor. Yeah, and that just has serious power. This bike probably has 25 to 30 more horsepower than my GS1100. And I never feel like the GS1100 is slow by any means or down on power. But getting back on this definitely feels quicker. Both bikes kind of have a nice tone to them, off throttle, coming up to a stop. Yeah, this thing is quick. Yeah, this Kawasaki definitely feels more modern. This, I guess the best way to think about this for me is just, it's like if money was no object and I could make the best 80s, early 80s superbike that I possibly could, this would be the end result. A bike that looks, it captures that look, but then it has high-end suspension, it has awesome high-end brakes on it, it's got modern sporting rubber. The wheel sizes, you can put, you know, the modern tires on it, and the bike just handles well, brakes well, very, very smooth. Really more power than you'd ever need on the street. And it's just a fun bike. Yep, I remember why I love the ZRX so much. It's just, it's got a little bit of a hooligan nature. It's not incredibly wheelie prone. It'll certainly bring the front end up when you want it to, but it always has just a very solid feel to it. Very smooth. That the motor is just super impressive, the way it makes such torque at low RPM. wants to rip your arms off. And while a bike like a VMAX might be a little bit quicker in a straight line, might be, the ZRX just, it's so much better everywhere else that it's really a neat bike. My favorite retro bike that I've ridden so far. Both the GS and the ZRX are very, very comfortable to ride. They don't needle you to go fast if you just want to cruise down through. Both of them are just a really nice place to spend the day. I would actually probably give all-day comfort to the GS, but it's borderline, and I guess body type too. If you're shaped a little differently than me, it might be different for you. And then there's that torque. Yay. That's fun. I know the camera's not showing it right now, but I've got a big grin. This is a bike that's just a hoot to ride.
All right, I don't know if you can tell, but that was a fun comparison for me to do. Super fun to ride these bikes back to back. Some things really stand out. The first thing is the suspension on these bikes. The way that I have the suspension tuned on this Suzuki is very similar to the way the suspension is set up on the Kawasaki. And so they, as far as the actual ride quality, the way they ride, the way they feel, it's very, very similar seat of the pants. One area, the Suzuki has a little bit higher bars on it, and they're a little bit wider. And so it is a little bit, I would say it's a little bit more comfortable. The fairing comes up a little higher too, gives a little bit better wind protection. And I would say just all around, if you're going to use the bike to tour and such, the Suzuki actually has a little bit of an advantage over the Kawasaki. But it's, you know, it's close. The Kawasaki is supremely smooth. It's actually, the engine is a little bit smoother than the one in the Suzuki. But they're both very engaging to drive. The Suzuki never feels slow. And even when I hopped from the ZRX to the Suzuki and then back to the ZRX. And after riding the ZRX, the Suzuki felt like it was really close to being on pace and very close to being performance-wise what the ZRX was. But when I hopped back to the ZRX, it was kind of obvious then that the ZRX is, you know, it definitely has a performance advantage as far as the motor goes, as far as the brakes go. It's a little bit of a trade-off though, because the Kawasaki's brakes, they're so powerful, and when you get in them, they can be a little bit grabby. They've got pretty significant initial bite, so as soon as you start to hit the brakes, it really slows down. And the same thing with the throttle. As soon as you get into that throttle, man, as soon as you crack it, that thing just wants to go. It really pulls, and that torque just really, any RPM above about 2,500 RPM, this thing is a rocket ship. So that, you know, when you drive them, sometimes the Suzuki is actually a little bit easier to drive because it's a little bit more forgiving on the throttle. You can give it, it will go fast, but you have to give it more throttle to get it to go fast. It will brake hard, but you have to actually put a little bit more effort and a little bit more travel into the lever to get it to brake hard. And so at lower speeds, it's not, you know, it's never twitchy. And it's not that the ZRX is twitchy, but it's just more sensitive on the controls. With the updated, you know, the wider wheels and tires, the wheels and tires on this ZRX are the same size as all the modern sport bikes use. They're 17-inch wheels. You've got a 120 up front and you've got a 180 in the back, and they just handle very, very nicely. You know, you, again, with those brakes and the way the suspension is set up, if you're going to ride this, like if we did a track day, man, this the ZRX would eat this guy for lunch. As far as road riding and the riding that I do, man, it's a toss-up. Both of these bikes, for me, are sentimental. My first big bike was a GS1100G. And so I've got a lot of fond memories of it. And I did a cafe project on that one as well. And so to me, when I ride this, it kind of brings back that time period, brings back my first motorcycle project. The ZRX, when I ride that, you know, I had a green one, and it had a Two Brothers pipe on it, and I transitioned, prior to getting the ZRX, I had transitioned to sport bikes. I had a ZX9, and when I rode the ZRX, it was so fun and carefree, and I could go slow without being uncomfortable, but I still had that performance to, you know, when I wanted to go fast, I could. And it was a revelation. It was the first big sport standard that I had, and I loved it. I've always thought the ZRX was probably one of the best looking bikes, just my favorite as far as the looks go. Just quality components everywhere you look. The fit and finish on this bike is astounding. Even today, this bike is 20 years old and it looks brand new. And you know, the finish holds up over time, and this one was well taken care of. It was a, you know, it's a very nice example of a ZRX. You know, which one do you guys think is the better machine? You go with the true antique, you know, the air-cooled vintage. You know, this is trying to evoke memories of this era of bike. So, you know, I think it's cool. They're each really cool to ride in their own way. The Kawasaki, to me, actually feels, even compared to much newer bikes, even stuff that's coming out today, it still feels very, very modern. There's only a couple little areas where it doesn't feel like a brand new machine. And I mean, it's just kind of a hair off. It's not even far off of that. So the interesting thing is it almost feels a little bit too modern. I almost wish it would feel a little bit more vintage, but I don't know how they would have done it. I really don't have any areas to fault the ZRX in. You know, ideally, if they could make this bike as plush riding and easy to ride as my Versys 1000, it would be like the perfect motorcycle. But both of these are a hoot to ride. I smile, you know, from ear to ear each time I ride either one of these. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. If you're a ZRX fan or a, you know, Suzuki GS fan, you know, let me know. The Kawasaki was designed as a kind of a throwback, a retro bike to embody this era and to evoke memories of this era of superbike. And you know, I love it. But I also love this era of superbike. I mean, that's a really cool, you know, it's a really cool thing. So let me know what you guys think. Again, I hope you found this video informative and entertaining. And until next time, enjoy the ride.